Hi, Preston. Thanks for joining and speaking with me today. Do you want to share a little bit about your background and what brought you to Proxyware and what you hope to achieve?
Absolutely. And I appreciate you taking some time to talk to me. My background spans back to about, I'd say, probably 2014. I started working for a small intellectual property company, heavily involved in fraud prevention on a number of different platforms. After some time, I took kind of a sabbatical from the fraud space and I ended up teaching math in high school for NC Math 2 down here in North Carolina, which really kind of broadened my experience, especially after spending all this time protecting those types of people. So, in general, moving from very heavy risk analytics to teaching math, and now I'm here at Proxyware, really kind of trying to tie off the whole story, moving from maybe protecting somebody's bottom line to really kind of being a force that can impact an individual's safety while they use the internet.
Quite a big change from the tech IP world to teaching.
It wasn't somewhere I expected to be, but I really fell into it pretty gracefully. Huge kind of perspective change on really what a teacher goes through, but also kind of a perspective on how public education works. So definitely a huge pivot.
I've heard from a lot of teachers that in today's world, teaching has changed a lot with the digital age. And that even the way that kids interact with each other has been a very different experience. What was your experience with the digital world and teaching?
I wasn't prepared for how ingrained technology had become. We used to have computer labs. Maybe you were there for once a week or something. Now you're literally carrying around a device everywhere you go. There's no textbooks. The computer is your resource as a student, but it is also a toy. And I wasn't prepared for just how many people are spending time using those devices for things that they're really not instructed to do. And it was a huge battle for any given day, just managing that screen time, especially when we're encouraged to bring these digital tools into the classroom, make things 21st century is a big plug. So the device management was definitely something I wasn't super prepared for. That's where a lot of the problems come from.
It's so interesting that so many states are focused on bell to bell cell phone free laws or regulations, and yet we hand students devices and they're on them all day long. And there's not really a ton of difference psychologically between being on a laptop and being on a cell phone, except that schools are supposed to minimize and limit what kids can have access to while they're sitting in a classroom on their device. How effective do you think schools are at actually limiting digital harm?
I don't know how they would measure that even, really. Their effectiveness in limiting harm, I would assume, is probably just measured by what they have in place. The punishments, I suppose, the consequences for unofficial use of devices or doing something you shouldn't be doing were pretty severe. But as far as preventing it from happening, there wasn't really anything in place other than make sure the devices are being used for some sort of educational task, like downtime. You shouldn't be letting students use the devices for non-educational things. And that just doesn't play out that way in the classroom. So I would say they wouldn't know if you asked them. Are they preventing harm? I would say that they probably would immediately say, well, yeah, I mean, there's no data privacy issues. Our network has never been taken down in the past couple of years. But as far as harm, I would say that there's probably a bit of a blind spot there, to be honest.
It's a really great point. A lot of people, when they think about how do you protect children, is traditional cybersecurity. We have antiviruses installed. We have not had network breaches. Data has not been extracted from the network. And none of those things are what things like bell to bell schedules are focused on, which is how do you prevent harmful content from reaching kids? How do you prevent cyberbullying, which has become just such a huge issue in the world of social media? How do you prevent access to adult content? And we hear from teachers all over the country that kids are sitting in classrooms looking at adult content. And the saddest part about that is Kids aren't the ones that are searching for that kind of content. No one is sitting in a classroom as a fourth grader or even a high schooler thinking, you know what I want to do in a room full of kids that I go to school with? Look at adult content. And yet, that is what's happening in schools because this kind of content is finding them. And no matter what digital harm you're talking about, kids don't go into the internet thinking, how can I find harmful content today? It is introduced to them first, typically through targeted content.
Absolutely. And one of the main avenues for that is going to be gaming, right? Every kid, if they have an extra 4 minutes, especially if we're talking about a high school kid, they are on these sites that are probably used to target those ads because we're talking like repositories of links to games. A lot of them are looking at free games. And then all of a sudden you have these ads that have these adult implications and then they're at some other piece of content kind of like hopping along that link. So definitely I've seen that firsthand. But yeah, that's what those content filters are supposed to block. You know, somebody wants to see something. Well, Zscaler, whomever else it may be, is going to block that right away. It's the mostness of putting it in front of people that Zscaler is not going to look at.
Yeah, exactly. They are designed to look for, is this kid searching for a term that contains this harmful thing? But they really don't know how to handle that harm coming to the kid directly without any sort of malicious intent. And you mentioned you weren't going to see those kind of ads. And that really is the point, right? The school administrators, the school teachers, they aren't seeing these digital harms because they're not the ones most likely to click on it. And for better or worse, the internet was all built and driven by how do you get people to engage with the content that you're selling to them. Teachers aren't going to go clicking on that kind of content. So they're not the target. They're not going to see it.
Exactly.
In your work as a teacher, you have written a white paper about some of the harms that you're seeing and some of the evasion of content filters and blocks. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. As I mentioned, devices was a challenge to manage with the students. And one of the things that kind of came on my radar was my kids, they really liked to play, they played games and they were not always the most appropriate games. So I kind of struggled with this asymmetry. You know, as a math teacher, I might be looking for a Sudoku puzzle and not allowed, right? Because it's entertainment or something. So that would get blocked. But I'm walking around and I see various games, everything from Minecraft, Roblox to things like Escape from Epstein's Island. These types of that some schools disallow at a high level. So I start thinking like, well, what is working here and what are they trying to achieve if I can't look up math games? My innocuous searches are blocked, but the students can get a hold. So I just start thinking about the whole system. So I start noting URLs and my kid has gone to the same URL and I teach high school down the road over here. My kid's in elementary over on this side of town. Well, what's happened? How do you know exactly what this site is that I've been kind of snooping on? So I think about it a little bit. I have his laptop and I ask him, well, how do you know this exists? Like, how do you know where to get these games? So he tells me, like, we've just known about it forever and ever and ever. So I start thinking back to my not so recent past and I start looking in, well, why would someone make this available to a kid or to anybody? Like, this is a lot of content, like games, it's all free. But just doing some very basic like web browser investigations, kind of looking at where these pages are talking, uncovered one of these kind of ad schemes, which is standard as how these MOs go. But the interesting part was the flow of where you go to play your game starts with kind of like a nice index page with instructions that was actually hosted on a Google site. So here you've got this Google site, which is probably never going to be looked at twice by like a perimeter tool. And it's telling you, okay, if you love xyzgames.com and you can't get to xyzgames.com, add a 1. If that doesn't work, add a 2. So these like kind of fallbacks that they're very publicly stating on this safe site, this trusted site, here's how this works if you want to play these games. And then once you get URL, you go to this landing page, it's just pages scrolling and scrolling of URLs. Like I'd be afraid to go there. Even if they are all valid games, like who knows which one of those is a link to who knows where. So I kind of wrote this up out of my own interest And I did put together it as like a little mini report. And this was well before I knew that proxyware even existed. And I sent this information to some tech folks at my district. And I was probably ignored, but it was very satisfying to start at proxyware and hear that, like, this is basically the problem. You're not going to see these things unless you are sitting right there in that seat, ideally behind a student as they are browsing the internet. And I, even in my experience and knowledge, was kind of surprised at the scale at which these kind of operations exist. It was surprising to me, and that shouldn't have been surprising, to be honest. So I kind of investigated this on my own, just public tools, just thinking about how does this work? What is the play? And how does it keep happening?
What's so interesting about that is we've lived and breathed digital trust and safety for a very long time. I've been in this space for 20 years now, and my kids have grown up as some of the most tech savvy there are just because that's kind of the world that I've lived in for so long. And yet, my own kids have been targeted with sextortion. But thankfully, we talked about this well before they were in high school and were targeted. So they didn't share any content, but many of their friends did. They still play these kind of games, and it like Escape from Epstein Island is a great example where social media, friend group pressure, all of these different things are pushing kids into these games that are really extreme content. And parents really have no idea about what is going on their kids' devices because they don't see it. But there are links that are shared across friend groups. There's even YouTube videos that, from a thumbnail, look like they're a Family Guy episode. And when you click on it, it's adult content. People know how to get around what is my parent going to see? What is the school filter going to see? And how do I bypass those to just do the things I want to do?
Definitely. Some of my students would start getting bothered if I was watching them on the computer because URLs would go down. Like there would be things they could do one day and they couldn't do the next. And I don't think I was doing anything. But you talk about like sharing things. And that is like a big catalyst, especially in a school. Like if one person knows how to do that one cool thing or get to that thing that you're not supposed to get to, like everybody's gonna know sooner or later. And it kind of just makes the problem that much worse.
Exactly. And filters are never going to keep up with the ways that bad actors are evading them. For example, if you go on to Google Translate and you ask it to translate a page that is, say, adult content, you can see it in the school because what the school sees is that it's Google Translate and they don't see the URL that's behind what's being translated. So there's all of these ways that kids know how to evade what adults are putting in their path. And that's not to say they're trying to find this really harmful content sitting in a classroom, but it could be something as innocuous as Roblox or Minecraft, where the school has blocked it because it's a game and they really want to play it while they're sitting in classrooms. So they figure out ways around how to do that. They're way more tech savvy than we'll ever be because we're putting roadblocks and they are finding ways around them to do the things that they want. And they grew up with technology in their hands.
Yeah, and I feel like they're smart enough that I feel like that gives the bad actors like more avenues to reach them,
Absolutely.
when you're comfortable with surfing the web like that.
Absolutely. And it's funny, you think about things like Roblox putting in age verification, and it's a great safety feature that they have launched to limit the amount of messaging that can happen between different age groups to protect children. And I was sitting at the dinner table with my kids just a couple of weeks ago talking about this new account verification measure. And my kids are like, all you have to do is print a picture and hold it up to your face and turn with the camera and you can bypass age verification. And that's something that I didn't talk to them about. They learned that from their friends who are doing these kind of things to be able to access games that are rated more mature, but not really understanding the downstream consequences that it may have and all of the things that they're being protected from when they just want to access this more mature game than they can based on their age setting.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, I'm interested to see how that goes, this whole age verification thing. There's definitely loopholes other than printing a picture for sure.
Absolutely. Facial recognition has come a long way, but I do think there's a lot of privacy protections and things like that which come into play when kids don't have IDs. And the only method to validate that they are how old they say they are is an AI model that's determining age based on just a quick video.
And where's that stored? Like, then all of a sudden you're storing
Right.
these things, so
Right.
a real problem.
You talk about there being multiple different pathways for bad actors to access kids within schools that bypass firewalls or network filtering. Let's talk a little bit about what those are.
Sure. When I'm trying to explain the problem and how proxyware addresses that with these prongs, I'm looking at three things. And the first one is really third party threat detection. What we're talking about is bad actors targeting users where they go. And we're usually talking about students or maybe senior citizens, targeting them through these kind of trusted websites and really mainstream platforms. And this has been pretty generally successful for these bad actors because in these trusted situations, we were just talking about Google Sites, it's very hard to determine what these threats are or to detect that these threats are happening unless you are something like Proxyware, where we can sit inside these networks and experience things like these residents or students do to try to uncover what that targeting really is. So that's kind of like the first prong. Second, this is something a little bit different, but we're talking about second party exposure verification. And this is sharing links or how to get to these game sites over and over and over and over again. While a lot of what we experience is targeted threats, there are situations where maybe a structural or a policy decision is making something possible, giving them an opportunity, I suppose. Maybe we're not searching for adult content, but we know how to get to it because we're curious, tech savvy kids. And that shouldn't be allowed, especially on these school networks. So that would be kind of that second party.
There's a really interesting thing that I've seen across AI policies being adopted in school districts where there's an assumption that in order to use an AI tool, the school would have to vet it, go through procurement, and install it for a kid to be able to access it. And so policies are written that way, not thinking about Gemini, Copilot, Chat GPT, Gronk, any Claude, you name it, right? There's so many tools that are available on the web that kids can access. And those tools also may come with third party pieces in them. Those tools can develop stories that can lure kids into different kinds of harms or even photos and turn them into nude photos. So, without really understanding kind of the holistic picture of the internet, many schools will rely on filtering what they know and blocking certain types of content at a very high level, not thinking about all of the ways that bad actors or even kids are able to get around them.
Exactly. So kind of like the third piece to this, which is, I guess you could call it, I mean, emerging probably isn't the best word, but we're talking like kind of on the fringe. And what I look at is this idea almost of, red teaming or penetration testing. A lot of security, especially the cybersecurity that we have, are all compliance based. You're told that in order for your users, your students to be protected while they're on those devices, check these boxes, install these things or something similar, and then you will be preventing harm or then you will be protecting your users. I don't necessarily think that that is true. I think a lot of us around here believe that compliance is not necessarily protection. going through the motions and checking the boxes for this tool or that tool, having this policy in place may be true, but all compliance really looks at is that those things exist. Like they're validating inputs or checking that you're doing the thing. They're not really addressing are these inputs having the intended effect, which for something like SEPA, that intended effect is that your students are not experiencing harmful things while they're on school devices or on the school network. So proxyware, and again, from the seat in the network, school has Zscaler and this content filter and this DNS, whatever it may be. But we've seen month over month continued vaping ads, or we are still able to be served adult content kind of through advertising or other things. So this idea of looking at compliance not as something to check, but as kind of like a standardized set of instructions to achieve something. And I think proxyware can look at whether or not that's truly being achieved from its unique position in the network.
Yeah, compliance is a really interesting thing. It is all a risk balancing game. It's here's a list of things that you have to do, and you do your best effort to comply with them. But if you fail, it doesn't mean that you're no longer compliant. It means, oh, maybe we need to close this gap over here, but we're still okay because we're doing our best. And I think when we're talking about child safety, are you doing your best from a regulatory perspective is very different than are kids being harmed. And so much money is spent in the industry on cybersecurity tools, and they're absolutely needed. Something like proxyware is never going to replace a security stack, but it does show you where your security stack is falling short without waiting for a kid to become victimized or groomed on a school device. We should be preventing that from happening. And in my opinion, one child is one too many to be experiencing these kind of online harms, whereas regulatory frameworks are really designed to give you a framework to work in, but are not guaranteed to make that number zero.
Yeah, I agree. And it's unfortunate because it is expensive. Public school goes through all that budgeting to have their security. They believe that they have it. So, I mean, I can see where that little bit of maybe misplaced assumption would exist.
Yeah, and really, traditional cybersecurity has not changed much in the last 20 years. It was designed for this very binary input of is something good or is something bad? And like we talked about with Google Sites, that's not a binary yes no. That is a tool that can be used either for good or for harm. But if you're looking at it in its entirety, it's more good than bad. And therefore, traditional cybersecurity tools will never block it. Content filtering tools aren't going to block it. And so there's too many shades of gray in today's world for traditional cybersecurity to be the only thing that's running, whether it's on a school or a senior facility or a veterans facility. There's just too much gray, and bad actors are exploiting that.
Yeah, I agree, definitely.
So, Preston, I know you're a father. As a father, what are your fears for the future of technology?
My biggest fear with technology, unfortunately, is that the people that want to do bad are going to continue to be the smarter of the two groups. And like the cat and mouse game, there's going to be more and more distance between those that know and those that don't. And I think it's going to create a big imbalance, which is kind of part of my reason for joining Proxyware is I think that the general users of the internet, whether they are on these ends of the spectrum where they're targeted more, I just think that they need more people on their side. So I do fear that technology is going to be taken by the bad actors. Not to sound doomsday, but I feel like they're the ones putting in the work, so to speak.
One of the things that I fear being a parent, which isn't so doomsday, but a fear nonetheless, is will our kids be able to cognitively understand and do functional jobs in the future without the use of technology or AI. We're really starting to see a decline in the ability for critical thinking skills, for example. Or even, I think about one of my sons, he's building video games and he's building AI tools that are looking at various things, which is great. But he never had to learn how to code to do that. He just had to be able to speak to an LL to design these things for him. And so that isn't like this great harm that's super scary as a parent, but it is just a interesting look at what is the future going to be as our kids grow up, as schools adopt AI agents, as it's how do you make schools more technologically savvy and what the impact that that has to children.
One of the things that I noticed as a teacher when it comes to AI, if you don't have the answer, you're stupid. If you don't have the answer, it means you don't know how to do the thing. There's no such thing as figuring it out, which as a non-teacher, a lateral entry teacher, I call myself a non-teacher. I was really bothered by this idea that if you have to think about something, then you're stupid. And I think maybe that's what you're hitting on. And maybe I do have similar fears just about society in general, that we've been siloed into this. Everything is so fast with tech. If you're not fast, then, well, then you missed, you failed or something.
I agree. There's this speed of knowing that kids have today because their cell phones, their AI agents, their whatever is able to tell them really fast, which isn't recall. But it's also, think about Amazon, everything being same day delivery. Or now you can sit at your house and have groceries delivered to you and you don't have to do anything. We have become an instant gratification society, and that has some pretty wide reaching consequences. Everything in today's world is really how much data do you give to someone else? And then in return, that someone else, that big tech company, makes your life easier. But it's really changing the dynamics of how do we interact with each other? What are our expectations? It's changing fundamentally, I think, how we are as humans.